So today I'm just going to talk to you very briefly about a jazz mouthpiece. It's one thing that people don't tend to think about when they want to be starting to sound jazzy. They get a little bit frightened of the fact that they might need to change a mouthpiece to sound a little bit different. Can I tell you that it makes a huge difference in the sound that you're able to make? So you just heard me play on my D'Addario Select Jazz. I've got it here in the marble effect. Again, like I said, I'm not going to go into detail about the makeup of the mouthpiece or the setup of it, anything like that. But what I am going to say is that I'm using the Select Jazz mouthpiece with the Select Jazz reed. This one, I believe, is a 3M, but I do chop and change between the strengths now and again just to keep mixing it up a little bit, seeing what kind of sound I can get with the different ones. I have also got the H-Lig on there as well. Another thing to mention is the weather. The time of year now, we're going into autumn. We've had a very, very hot summer. It's a good idea as the weather starts to change to just try a few different reeds out, because it does make quite a big difference depending on what the weather's been doing. And they do tend to take quite a hammering reeds when the weather is quite hot, when it's quite humid, when it dries out, when it gets colder. So do keep chopping and changing your reeds just to make sure that it's the right one that you've got. One thing I will mention as well is I have been experimenting with the Venn reed recently, and if you haven't tried it already, go out and get one. They are pretty impressive, to be honest, pretty impressive. Quite interestingly, I don't tend to have found the right balance with a jazz setup yet, and I am experimenting with a few different strengths of them, but my classical setup, wow, I stick that on my D'Addario Reserve mouthpiece that I use for my classical sound on my tenor, and wow, it just works. You basically have to do nothing to it, stick it on the mouthpiece, and it works. It's a classic Charlie Parker Omnibook, just picking a little phrase out of there and just making it sound jazzy. I find it a lot easier to make something sound jazzy with this mouthpiece and this setup as well. So with a jazz mouthpiece, you're going to tend to go maybe half a strength, maybe even a full strength, weaker in number. So if, say, I'm using a 3 or a 3.5, I think that is actually a 3 plus. I'm using Venn on my classical setup. I tend to use 3 plus, maybe 3.5 when I'm using the cane reed. The reserve reeds again with that mouthpiece. So here I've gone for the 3 medium. I've also got 3 soft reeds that I'm experimenting with at the minute, but I wouldn't be afraid of even going back to a 2.5 sometimes, just to see what that feels like, see what it sounds like, because you get a lot more flexibility with that mouthpiece opening being a little bit wider, a lot more flexibility in that reed, so you're going to need it a little bit less of a strength than you're used to playing possibly on a classical setup. You're not going to get as much resistance with a jazz setup, which is ideal. That's what you kind of want. You want to have that flexibility in sound. So just to give you an idea about what the sound difference will be between a jazz sound and a classical sound, I've just swapped over to my reserve mouthpiece with the Venn reed, just to give you an idea. So this is going to have a little bit more resistance to it. It's going to be a little bit of a softer, rounder, focused sound. There's going to be a real focus to this sound, and that's what I want with a classical sound. So here we go. So you can hear there's a lot more of a focus to that sound, and even when I'm going down low, I'm not going to get that kind of subtone type fluffy sound down at the bottom, which I'm after on my jazz setup. With this, needs much more focus and prominence to that front of that sound. So with this phrase, for example, I want that low D I'm playing there to be really rounded and full. There's a bit of resistance to that sound, which is what I like with a classical setup. I like that resistance. I don't like it being too easy blowing, too free blowing. I want that little bit of resistance. I feel like I've got more control over the sound. Now back to the jazz setup. I'm going to give you an idea of that phrase that I just played there, and I had that full, rich, warm sound on that bottom D that I played. This is going to be a little bit more subtony. It's going to be a little bit more the kind of sound that I'm after in my jazz setup. All I've changed is the reed and the mouthpiece. Everything else is going to stay exactly the same. Hear that? So a lot more of a subtone sound down at the bottom. I've got a little bit more flexibility with my embouchure to get that sound. Hear that? I get that subtone sound. I really drop that bottom jaw down and I get the subtone sound at the lower sound. With my classical setup, I'm after a really focused, full, rich sound on that, not after that subtone sound. Actually, it's not as easy with that classical setup. Combination of the mouthpiece and the reed. That's all that's changed. Same ligature, H-lig from D'Addario. This is with the jazz setup before it was with the classical setup. So I would actually say that one of the most important things to experiment with when you're after changing your sound from a classical sound to a jazz sound, maybe you just get into that position now where you're getting into more intermediate type music and you're thinking, I just want to change my sound a little bit. I'm hearing something and I want to sound like that. Your teacher might have really worked on you to get a really strong embouchure, to get a really strong air stream pushed through the instrument with a beginner mouthpiece maybe. If you're wanting to try and find that jazz sound now, the mouthpiece and the reed are definitely the things that you should be experimenting with. I would urge you to get to a shop where you can possibly try all of these things out. There are lots and lots of shops throughout the country where you're able to go in, speak to someone face to face. They will be able to give you bits and pieces to go in a practice room and try. Possibly even, if it's a shop that does this, will allow you to take some things away with you to try out and maybe rehearse in a band or trying different acoustics. That sort of thing is an ideal situation to be in. You don't want to be rushed into a job or rushed into a purchase and then not be happy with it. You must make sure that you're happy with it. You try it with a number of different reeds. You try it in different situations before you decide on your mouthpiece. Change to sound a little bit more jazzy.